What if the greatest treasure in the unforgiving West wasn't gold, but the heart of a woman who had been thrown away like trash? What if one lone cowboy, a man scarred by his own losses, was the only one who could see her true worth? Have you ever wondered if a single act of kindness could build an empire of love from the dust of despair? This is a story about that very possibility, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, the most valuable things are not owned, but protected. The sun was a merciless hammer over the plains, beating down on the cracked earth until it shimmered with a heat that promised no life, only endurance. For Caleb, endurance was a language he understood. It was etched into the sun-creased lines around his pale blue eyes, carved into the set of his jaw, and settled deep in the quiet solitude of his soul. He rode the fence line of his modest ranch, a solitary figure against an endless canvas of ochre and blue. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust Devil, moved with a familiar, plodding rhythm, the creak of saddle leather the only sound besides the whisper of the hot wind. This was his kingdom, a stretch of hard-won land that had cost him everything but his own breath. Years ago, it had cost him a wife, lost to the fever that swept through their wagon train like a prairie fire. It had cost him a daughter, a tiny soul too fragile for the frontier's cruelties. Now, the silence was his only companion, a constant reminder of what he had lost and a vow to never risk such a loss again. He was a good man, a just man, but his heart was a fortress, its gates rusted shut. As he crested a low butte, his gaze, ever watchful for stray cattle or the telltale sign of a predator, caught on something unnatural. A flash of white. Not the bleached white of bone, but the stark, out-of-place white of fine fabric, a ghost against the rust-colored dirt. He pulled Dust Devil to a halt, his hand resting instinctively on the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. Trouble in the West came in many forms, and beauty was often its most deceptive mask. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the loose soil, and approached with the cautious tread of a man who knew that the land gave no second chances. The white fabric was the tattered remains of a wedding dress, its lace snagged by sagebrush and its silk stained with grime and something dark that looked terrifyingly like dried blood. And in it, curled into a shape of profound abandonment, was a woman. Her hair, the color of spun gold, was matted with dirt and leaves. Her face was pale, her lips cracked and blue, but she was breathing. Shallow, ragged breaths that spoke of a fight not yet lost. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her still form. She couldn't have been more than 19, a girl on the cusp of womanhood, discarded here like a broken doll. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. As if sensing his presence, her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sky, filled with a maelstrom of fear, pain, and a surprising spark of defiance. She flinched, trying to pull away, a small, wounded sound escaping her throat. Easy now. Caleb's voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed, but it held no threat. It held a deep, resonant calm that seemed to quiet the frantic beating of her heart. "I'm not going to hurt you." He saw the story in the wreckage of a finery, a hopeful bride brought west for a new life, only to be met with a brutal end before it could even begin. He saw the cruelty of the man who must have done this, who could look upon this fragile beauty and choose to destroy it. And in that moment, the rusted gates of his heart creaked open, not with love, but with a fierce, unwavering wave of pure, righteous protection. He was a man who had failed to protect his own family from the impersonal cruelty of fate. He would not fail to protect this stranger from the deliberate cruelty of man. He uncorked his canteen and gently lifted her head, letting a few precious drops of water moisten her lips. She drank, her throat working convulsively. "Who did this to you?" he asked, the question a hard edge in his soft tone. She shook her head, tears welling in her stormy eyes and tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. He just left me." The words were a whisper, a ghost of a voice. "Left you." The phrase echoed in the vast emptiness of the plains and in the hollow chambers of Caleb's own past. He understood being left. He understood being alone. He wrapped her in his horse blanket, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. Her head lolled against his chest, a sigh of surrender passing her lips. As he settled her in front of him on the saddle, her slight frame cradled against his strength, he made a silent vow. To her, to the ghosts of his past, and to the unforgiving land itself. This woman, this forgotten bride, would not be left again. Not while he still drew breath. Her name was Rosalind. She whispered it to him as he carried her across the threshold of his small, sturdy ranch house. The home was like the man, sparse, clean, and built to withstand anything. A stone hearth dominated one wall, A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a narrow bed was tucked into a corner. It was a shelter, not a home, a place for a man to wait out the years alone. He laid her gently on his own bed, the irony not lost on him. For 5 years, no one but him had crossed this threshold. Now, a near stranger with eyes like a tempest lay in his bed, bringing with her a storm of complications he hadn't known he was prepared to face. He worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency, cleaning the gash on her forehead and the cuts on her arms. He moved with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior, his hands, so used to rope and iron, now tending to her wounds with the delicacy of a surgeon. He prepared a thin broth, holding the spoon to her lips until she had finished every last drop. He asked no more questions, sensing she needed silence more than interrogation. He sat in a chair by the fire, watching her sleep, the flames casting flickering shadows on her pale face. He saw the ghost of the woman she was meant to be, a bride, full of hope and dreams, ready to start a new chapter. And he saw the woman she had become, a survivor, etched with the harsh reality of this land. The next morning, she was awake, propped up against the pillows, her gaze clear and direct. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. She told him her story in a voice that trembled but never broke. She had traveled from the east, an arranged marriage to a man named Bartholomew Corbin, a man who owned the sprawling cattle empire to the north, a man whose wealth was matched only by his reputation for ruthlessness. Her family, once prosperous merchants, had fallen on hard times, and this marriage was meant to be their salvation. But word of their financial ruin had outpaced her journey. When she arrived, Corbin had taken one look at her, his eyes cold and dismissive. He had called her a worthless liability, a pretty piece of damaged goods with no dowry to her name. He had refused the marriage, refused her entry into the town, and when she had pleaded, he had his men drive her out into the wilderness, to be erased by the elements. He said trash should be thrown out with the trash, she whispered, the memory bringing a fresh wave of shame and pain to her face. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. He knew of Corbin, a man who bought and bullied his way to power, who saw people as assets or obstacles. To him, Rosalind had been an asset that had depreciated in value. And so, he had discarded her. He was wrong, Caleb said, his voice a low growl. He's a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. The words hung in the air between them, a simple declaration of truth that seemed to mend a small piece of her fractured spirit. In the days that followed, a quiet routine settled over the ranch. Rosalind, refusing to be an invalid, insisted on helping. She mended Caleb's worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She took over the cooking, turning his meager supplies of flour and salted pork into meals that tasted of home. She found a small, neglected patch of earth behind the house and began coaxing a garden from the stubborn soil. She worked with a quiet dignity, her every action a defiance of Corbin's cruel assessment. She was not trash. She was a creator, a nurturer, a force of life in a place that was so often defined by death. Caleb watched her, feeling the icy shell around his heart begin to thaw. He found himself talking to her, sharing stories of the land, of the way the seasons turned, of the hawk that nested in the tall cottonwood by the creek. He never spoke of his wife or daughter. That door remained closed. But other doors, ones he hadn't even known existed, were beginning to open. He was teaching her how to read the clouds for rain one afternoon when his old ranch hand, Gus, rode in. Gus was a wiry old man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen too much. He was fiercely loyal to Caleb, the only family the cowboy had left. He took one look at Rosalind, her golden hair shining in the sun as she laughed at something Caleb said, and his expression soured. Later, when they were alone in the barn, Gus didn't mince words. "You're playing with fire, son," he rasped, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "A woman like that, especially one that crossed Bart Corbin, is a lightning rod for trouble. You know his reputation. She was left to die, Gus," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What was I supposed to do? Leave her for the coyotes?" "There's a difference between helping and harboring," Gus shot back. "Corbin ain't a man who likes loose ends. He'll come for her, and he'll tear down anything and anyone standing in his way. That includes you and this ranch you bled for." Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew Gus was right. He knew the risk. But as he looked out toward the small house, where a light now burned in the window, a warm, inviting glow against the encroaching twilight, he knew he couldn't turn back. That light was more than just a lamp. It was a beacon. It was a home. For the first time in 5 years, He wasn't just coming back to a shelter. He was coming home to someone. The solitude he had once wrapped around himself like a protective cloak now felt like a cage, and Rosalind, with her quiet strength and stormy eyes, was the key. He had faced down blizzards, droughts, and stampedes to keep this ranch. He would face down Bartholomew Corbin to protect her. Trouble, as Gus predicted, did not wait long to arrive. It came on a Sunday, in a cloud of dust and the thunder of a dozen hooves. Bart Corbin and his men reined in their horses just beyond the fence, a dark line of menace against the bright morning sky. Corbin sat atop a magnificent black stallion, his tailored suit and polished boots a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way, with eyes as black and empty as a starless night. He surveyed the small ranch with a contemptuous sneer, his gaze finally landing on Rosalind, who stood on the porch, her hand instinctively flying to her throat. Caleb moved to stand in front of her, a solid, unmovable wall of denim and determination. "Corbin," Caleb said, his voice even. "This is private property," Corbin laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Everything in this valley is my property, one way or another, rancher. I'm just here to collect something I misplaced." His eyes flickered to Rosalind. "A piece of trash I forgot to burn." Rosalind flinched as if struck, but Caleb didn't even blink. "The lady is under my protection," he stated, his hand hovering near his pistol. The air grew thick and heavy, the silence broken only by the snorting of the horses and the buzz of a fly. Corbin's smile was a predatory slash. "Protection? You think you can protect her from me? I own the sheriff, I own the bank, I own the town. You, Cowboy, own a pile of dirt and a handful of scrawny cattle. You are nothing." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I'm giving you one chance. Hand over the girl, and I'll forget I ever saw this pathetic excuse for a ranch. Refuse, and I will grind you into the dust you so clearly love." Caleb's gaze was like granite. "You heard me the first time. Get off my land." For a moment, it seemed violence would erupt. Corbin's men shifted, their hands moving toward their own guns. But Corbin held up a hand, his cold smile returning. "Have it your way," he said, pulling on his reins to turn his horse. "But don't say I didn't warn you. Some things are more trouble than they're worth." He glanced back at Rosalind, his eyes filled with a chilling promise. "And you, my dear, will learn that lesson the hard way." They rode off, leaving a trail of dust and a palpable sense of dread in their wake. Rosalind was trembling, her face ashen. Caleb turned to her, his expression softening. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. "He won't touch you," he said, the words a solemn oath. "I won't let him." She looked up at him, her storm-grey eyes searching his. She saw no fear, only an unshakable resolve. In that moment, she knew she was safer with this quiet, solitary cowboy than she had ever been in her life of supposed privilege. But she also knew, with a sinking heart, that Gus had been right. She was a lightning rod, and the storm had just begun. Corbin was a man who preferred to let his power do the talking. His retaliation was not swift and bloody, but slow and suffocating, designed to choke the life from Caleb's ranch and spirit. A week after the confrontation, a section of Caleb's fence was cut, and nearly a third of his herd was driven off into the Badlands, scattered and likely lost for good. A few days later, the small stream that watered his south pasture turned brackish and foul. Someone had dumped a barrel of lye into it upstream. Caleb and Gus worked from sunup to sundown, their faces grim, their bodies aching. They rode for days, rounding up what few cattle they could find. They dug a new channel to bypass the poisoned water, their hands raw and bleeding. Through it all, Rosalind was their shadow, their support. She brought them water in the fields, her presence a silent encouragement. She cooked them hearty meals that replenished their strength. She sat with them in the evenings, her quiet courage a balm to their frayed nerves. She felt a crushing weight of guilt, seeing the toll Corbin's vendetta was taking. "This is my fault," she said one night, her voice choked with emotion as she stitched a tear in Caleb's shirt. "He's doing this because of me. Maybe I should just leave. Go to the next town, find work." Caleb stopped her by placing his hand over hers, stilling the needle. His touch was warm and firm. "No," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "This ain't on you. This is on him. This is who he is. If it wasn't you, it'd be some other homesteader whose land he wanted, some other person he saw as weak. Men like Corbin don't need a reason to be cruel. They just need an opportunity. You're not the reason, Rosalind. You're just the reason I'm finally fighting back." The way he said her name sent a shiver through her. It wasn't just a word. It was a statement. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a burden or a victim, but as a person worth fighting for. The rumors started next. In the nearby town of Redemption, a place Caleb rarely visited, whispers began to circulate. They were poison, crafted by Corbin's paid sycophants. They painted Rosalind as a harlot, a schemer who had tried to trap the wealthy rancher and was now shacked up with some backwater cowboy. When Caleb rode in for supplies, he was met with cold shoulders and suspicious glares. The store owner, a man he traded with for years, suddenly found his prices had doubled. The blacksmith claimed he was too busy to shoe Dust Devil. The weight of the isolation pressed in on him, but it was the injustice done to Rosalind's name that truly ignited his anger. He walked into the saloon, the hub of all town gossip, and stood in the center of the room. The talk died down. Men looked away, suddenly fascinated by their drinks. Caleb's voice cut through the silence, clear and cold as a winter morning. "I hear there's been some talk about the lady staying at my ranch," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "I'm here to tell you that she is a woman of honor and courage. And the next man I hear speaking ill of her will answer to me directly." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet deadliness in his tone was more effective than any shout. One of Corbin's cronies, a bulky man with a mean streak, snorted. "She's Corbin's cast off." Everyone knows what that means. Before the man could finish his smirk, Caleb had crossed the room. He didn't throw a punch. He simply grabbed the man by the front of his shirt, his knuckles brushing the man's fleshy chin, and lifted him halfway out of his chair. "It means," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "that Corbin is a coward who preys on those he thinks are weaker than him. And that anyone who parrots his lies is just as much of a coward." He released the man, who fell back into his chair with a grunt. Caleb turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. He had not won them over, but he had planted a seed of doubt. He had drawn a line in the sand. That night, the air was different. The shared danger, the public defense of her honor, had forged a new intimacy between them. They sat outside, watching the stars prick the vast, velvet darkness of the sky. The silence was no longer one of solitude, but of shared understanding. It was Caleb who finally broke it, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I had a family once," he began, his eyes fixed on the distant constellations. "A wife, Mary, and a little girl, Sarah. She had hair like yours, like spun gold." Rosalind's heart ached for him. She said nothing, knowing this was a story he had to tell in his own time, in his own way. "We came west with a wagon train full of dreams. Bought this land. We were going to build a dynasty," he chuckled, the sound bitter. "But the fever came. It took them both in less than a week. I buried them myself, right over that ridge." He pointed to a small hill, silhouetted against the stars, where a lone cypress tree stood guard. "After that, I closed myself off. Figured it was safer. Can't lose what you don't have. For 5 years, it worked. And then I found you." He finally turned to look at her, and in the faint starlight, she could see the raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes. It was a look of profound pain, and something else, a dawning, terrifying hope. "When I saw you lying there, so helpless, it was like I was failing them all over again. I couldn't save Mary and Sarah from the fever, but I swore on their graves that I could save you from him." The confession hung in the air, a fragile, beautiful, heartbreaking thing. Rosalind felt tears slide down her cheeks. She reached out and placed her hand on his, her fingers lacing with his strong, calloused ones. "You don't have to save me, Caleb," she whispered. "You just have to stand with me." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, his gaze tracing her features as if memorizing them. He saw her not as a reminder of his failure, but as a promise of a second chance. He saw her fierce spirit, her unwavering kindness, her unyielding resilience. He saw a woman who had been told she was worthless, yet possessed a wealth of character richer than any cattle baron's empire. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She leaned toward him, her stormy eyes closing as his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of wild passion, but of deep, aching tenderness. It was a kiss of shared sorrows and unspoken promises. It was the quiet collision of two lonely souls finding a harbor in each other. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "Rosalind," he breathed her name like a prayer. "You are not a liability. You are not trouble. You are Everything, the words settled in her heart, healing cracks she didn't even know were there. In his arms, under the vast, starry sky, she was no longer the girl who was dumped like trash. She was a woman who was cherished, a woman who was worth fighting for. She was home. The peace they found in that moment was a fragile thing, a candle flame in a rising wind. Corbin was not a man to be thwarted or ignored. Caleb's public defiance in the saloon had been a direct challenge to his authority, an insult he could not abide. His campaign of attrition had failed to break the cowboy spirit. Now, he would resort to a more direct and brutal approach. He decided to remove the cowboy's only support. One afternoon, Gus rode out to check a remote part of the property and didn't return by nightfall. Caleb felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. Gus was as reliable as the sunrise. He would never stay out after dark without reason. Caleb saddled Dust Devil, his movements tight with worry. "I'm going with you," Rosalind said, appearing at his side, a rifle held firmly in her hands. He started to protest, to tell her it was too dangerous, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It was the same defiant fire he had seen when he first found her. She was not a spectator in this fight. She was a combatant. "My father taught me how to shoot," she said simply. "I'm a better shot than you think. And you're not leaving me behind." He saw the truth in her words. They were a team. Her fight was his, and his was hers. He nodded grimly, and they rode out together into the deepening twilight. They found Gus's horse first, its reins trailing in the dust. A little further on, they found a note, pinned to a tree with a hunting knife. The message was crude and chillingly clear. The old man for the girl. Devil's Canyon. Dawn, it was a trap, and Caleb knew it. Devil's Canyon was a maze of rock and shadow, a perfect place for an ambush. Corbin wanted to isolate him, to force him into a desperate choice, save his friend or protect the woman he was coming to love. But Corbin had made a fatal miscalculation. He saw Rosalind as a prize, a pawn to be traded. He didn't see the woman of steel who now rode beside Caleb, her face set with grim determination, the rifle resting easily in her arms. "He thinks I'm the weakness," Rosalind said, her voice low and steady as they planned their approach under the cover of darkness. "He's about to find out he's wrong. They didn't ride in blind." Caleb knew this land, every rock and ravine. He had hunted in Devil's Canyon since he was a boy. He knew its secrets, its hidden paths and vantage points. Corbin had chosen the location for its tactical advantage, but it was an advantage that belonged to Caleb. They left the horses tethered in a hidden alcove and proceeded on foot, moving like ghosts through the pre-dawn gloom. They could see Corbin's campfire in the center of the canyon floor, a single point of light in the darkness. 3 men were silhouetted against the flames, with Gus tied to a rock nearby, his head bowed. Corbin was not among them. He would be watching from above, waiting for Caleb to walk into the kill zone. "You take the high ground to the east," Caleb whispered to Rosalind, pointing to a ridge that overlooked the camp. "Don't fire unless you have to, or until I do." "Keep them distracted," she nodded, her eyes meeting his in the dark. There was no fear, only trust. She squeezed his arm once, a silent promise, and then melted into the shadows. Caleb circled around to the west, climbing the steep canyon wall with a silent agility that would have surprised anyone who only knew him as a simple rancher. But his past held more than just ranching and loss. It held a time in the war, a time when he had learned the grim arts of survival and combat. He found his perch, a rocky outcrop that gave him a clear view of the entire scene. He watched as the sky began to lighten from black to a deep indigo. He saw Corbin step out onto an opposing ledge, a rifle in his hands, his eyes fixed on the canyon entrance where he expected Caleb to appear. The trap was set. The bait was in place. The hunter was waiting. But the prey was not where he expected. The first rays of dawn kissed the canyon rim. One of the men by the fire kicked Gus. "Wake up, old man." Showtime. Caleb raised his rifle, the stock cool and familiar against his cheek. He took a steadying breath and aimed not at the men, but at the coffee pot hanging over the fire. He squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon like a thunderclap. The coffee pot exploded, spraying hot liquid and grounds over the surprised men. They scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the shadows. From the opposite ridge, a second shot rang out. "Rosalind!" A bullet ricocheted off the rock near one of the gunmen, forcing him to duck back behind his cover. The carefully laid ambush had dissolved into chaos. Corbin, perched on his ledge, frantically scanned the canyon walls, trying to locate the source of the attack. He had expected one man, walking into a trap. He was now facing two skilled shooters, hidden and in control. Caleb used their confusion to his advantage. He fired again, his bullet striking the rock just inches from Corbin's head, sending splinters of stone into his face. Corbin cried out and stumbled back, his rifle clattering to the ground. Down below, Caleb's second shot had pinned down one of the henchmen. Rosalind's covering fire kept the other two occupied. It was the opening Caleb needed. He slid down a shale slope, landing lightly on the canyon floor, his Colt already in his hand. "Let him go," he yelled, his voice commanding and absolute. The two remaining henchmen, seeing their boss incapacitated and Caleb appearing as if from nowhere, hesitated. Their loyalty was to Corbin's money, not to his cause. It wasn't worth dying for. They dropped their guns and raised their hands. Caleb moved swiftly, cutting Gus free. The old man was bruised but otherwise unharmed. He looked at Caleb, a glimmer of profound respect in his eyes. "Knew you'd come, son. Didn't know you'd bring cavalry." He nodded up toward the ridge where Rosalind stood, rifle at the ready. On the ledge above, Bart Corbin staggered to his feet, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. His arrogance had been his undoing. He looked down at Caleb, at the freed prisoner, at the woman on the ridge who had defied him. He had lost. His power, his reputation, his control, it had all been dismantled by one stubborn cowboy and the trash he had thrown away. He let out a roar of pure rage and lunged for his fallen rifle, a final, desperate act. Caleb's pistol was already aimed. "Don't," he said, his voice flat and final. But Corbin was beyond reason. He grabbed the rifle and swung it around. Caleb fired. The shot was not to kill, but to disarm. The bullet tore through the wooden stock of Corbin's rifle, shattering it in his hands and sending him stumbling backward with a cry of pain. Defeated, disarmed, and utterly humiliated, Corbin stared down at Caleb, his black eyes burning with impotent hatred. His reign of terror was over, broken not by a greater force of wealth or power, but by simple, unyielding decency. The sun was fully risen now, flooding the canyon with golden light. It was the dawn of a new day. As the sheriff, finally spurred into action by Caleb's stand, arrived to take Corbin and his men into custody, Caleb looked up at the ridge. Rosalind was making her way down, her face smudged with dust, her hair coming loose from its braid, but to him, she had never looked more beautiful. She was not a damsel he had rescued. She was a partner who had fought beside him. They returned to the ranch not as a protector and his ward, but as equals. The shadow of Corbin was gone, lifted from the land and from their lives. The ranch, once a symbol of Caleb's solitary existence, now felt like a shared sanctuary, a place of new beginnings. That evening, as they stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Caleb turned to her. He took both of her hands in his. He thought of all the years of silence, of the fortress he had built around his heart. She had walked right through the gates, not by force, but with a quiet grace that had healed him in ways he never thought possible. He got down on one knee, there on the worn wooden porch of the simple house that had become their home. He had no fine words, no poet's tongue. He only had the truth. "Rosalind," he began, his voice thick with an emotion that humbled him. "I don't have an empire of cattle or a fortune in the bank. All I have is this land, this home, and a heart that you somehow brought back to life. It's not much, but it's all yours, if you'll have it." Tears streamed down Rosalind's face, but they were tears of joy, washing away the last traces of the pain and humiliation she had endured. She had been cast out, told she was worthless. And now, this good, honorable man was offering her everything he was, everything he had. He was offering her a kingdom built not on dirt and fences, but on love and respect. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Oh, Caleb, yes." He slid a simple, hand-carved wooden ring onto her finger, a token made not of gold, but of something far more precious. He stood and pulled her into his arms, and in that embrace, two broken halves became whole. "So, let me ask you again. Can a single act of kindness change the world?" For one cowboy and the bride he saved from the dust, it did. It proved that a woman's worth is not measured by her dowry, but by the strength of her spirit. It showed that the greatest empires are not built on land, but on love. What do you think? Can love truly conquer all, even in the wild, untamed heart of the West? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that everyone, no matter how lost they seem, is worth an empire.